a really difficult time in 2017. The list of ordinary acts that are called covert white supremacy has been growing exponentially since the Trump presidency began. And as the widening divide over NFL protests shows, the racially tinged culture war is only gaining momentum. Conservative media loves the liberal obsession with declaring innocuous activities white supremacy because the wild headlines are red meat for talk radio and email newsletters. But mainstream right-wing commentary on these stories is amazingly shallow. Republican lawmakers use a standard soundbite comprised of an indignant denial of GOP racism, plus a preemptive disavowal of any racists. This earns them precisely zero credit with the media and the left. Conservative pundits lament the loss of common-sense American values without offering any explanation for why those values have been in freefall since around 1965. The mainstream right seems to regard declarations of white supremacy as isolated incidents and politically foolish acts perpetrated by rage-filled progressives. The GOP is genuinely surprised every time they lose ground in the culture war to such seemingly ridiculous attacks. By declaring such attacks madness, conservative pundits absolve themselves of responsibility to analyze and counter these assaults on whiteness. The mainstream right is not curious enough to track the progression of allegations of white supremacy, but the left does have a clever method to their apparent madness. The left begins an anti-white attack by condemning some distant act of racism so that moderate whites can comfortably agree. Once whites have shown their willingness to concede a minor point, the left rapidly moves the goalposts until those tolerant, progressive whites are themselves accused of racism. Let's use the symbol X to represent any white institution or activity. X could be sports, higher education, Hollywood, the music industry, or local government. The left's attacks will follow the same general pattern, no matter what X represents. Using this alt-right guide to white supremacy, you'll be able not only to understand the leftist tactic being used, you'll also be able to predict for friends and family the next stage of white supremacy outrage. Whatever topic is selected for forced re-education is first attacked through its history. There's a legacy of racism in X. Therefore, the modern version of X must be made more inclusive and diverse. The politically correct white dupes, be they liberal or conservative, will then make an offer of support in good faith. The most powerful institutions and individuals will bend over backwards to get non-whites to the front of the line in X. The changes implemented in the name of diversity lead only to the decline in the quality of X. But guilt-ridden whites are willing to accept that if that means that they are immune to charges of racism. Unfortunately, at this point, the totally not racist whites have accepted the basic premise of a historical legacy of racism, so they're powerless to object when the institutional change that merely adds some diversity to white organizations is declared not good enough. At this stage of the attack, there will be a spate of headlines alleging that there is more work to be done to overcome racism. Once the accommodating whites have done everything possible to make X more inclusive, short of dismantling X altogether, they unexpectedly find themselves under attack for their very efforts at inclusion. Everything a white person does, including giving undeserved help and affirmative action to non-whites, is classified as white supremacy. The institution X is entirely taken over by non-whites, which means that X ceases to perform its stated function and is reduced to a wealth transfer program in which whites silently provide the money and managerial skill to facilitate their own decline. This process does not merely condemn whites for protecting their own interests. You know that old saying, if you can't beat them, join them. Well, if you're white, even joining in the erasure of your own race is not good enough. The final stage in the white supremacy gambit is the open condemnation of whiteness itself, as inherently evil. To review, first, an institution whites invented is declared racist. Next, the diverse version of the institution is declared inefficient. Then all actions of whites become racist. And finally, the mere existence of whites is declared white supremacy. That last stage is quite a compliment when you think about it. People of color are so intimidated by the achievements and potential of whites that our very existence on Earth is de facto supremacy and an inherent hate crime. The white supremacy gambit clearly shows the inadequacy of GOP political philosophy. When a Republican talks about common sense, American values, or the Constitution, they're merely trying to avoid identity politics. But identity politics are inextricably linked to all the values that Republicans hold dear. The mythic age of common sense was just a time when the social norms that conservatives like were the dominant force in society, and American values can only be conservative to the extent that America is peopled by white Europeans. The Constitution was never intended to be the governing document for a heterogeneous country of Muslims, Hindus, Jews, Africans, and Hispanics. If anyone had asked the Founding Fathers to write a governing document for such people, the result would have been more extreme than anything advocated by a 21st century so-called white supremacist. But the modern GOP cheerfully and suicidally persists in applying European governmental norms to every third world group that can be imported into the United States. A cursory glance at voting patterns and opinion polls shows where this approach will lead. The modern GOP is committed to the mutually exclusive goals of maintaining the civic virtues enshrined by the founders in the Constitution and also treating the United States as a demographically amorphous country, where paperwork, not blood and culture, makes people American. When Ben Shapiro tweets that he's not concerned about the browning of America, he typifies the foolishness of all conservatives and reveals which of the two goals will take precedence. In a few decades, conservatives' appeals to the Constitution will be seen as a version of Will Rogers' quip about stupidity. If following the Constitution got us into this mess, why can't following the Constitution get us out? After America has lost its white majority with no resistance from Shapiro or other conservatives, and the promised ideological conversion of non-whites fails to materialize, the few conservatives who are left will argue that the new Hispanic and Muslim cultural norms are just as American as the European traditions they replaced, because all the Muslims and Hispanics are legal citizens of the United States. The absurdity of this ideology is egregious. The politicians who claim to be conserving American culture will be praising totally different cultures and just calling them American. Accepting the infinite malleability of America and the universal acceptability of the Constitution means that conservatives can never make a principled objection to any demographic or cultural change proposed by the left. Republicans may object out of habit, but they fundamentally cannot explain why it would be good for America to remain a majority white country and preserve its white supremacist history. The alt-right fundamentally agrees with the left's assessment of Western civilization. Shakespeare is white supremacy. Free speech and meritocracy are white supremacy. Math, logic, and science are white supremacy. All of these civilizational attainments can only thrive, indeed, can only survive with a white European society that seeks its own interests without worrying about the hurt feelings of non-whites. As John Derbyshire has said, there must be something good about white supremacy, because a few billion non-whites are desperate to move to white countries where this so-called white supremacy is taking place. Every attempt to exploit white guilt or redress racial grievances, no matter how innocuous and justified it may seem, leads eventually to the condemnation of whiteness itself. Time to wake up.